What if some of the best, healthiest vegetables just disappeared from our plates? Long ago, 14th century farmers grew 14 amazing superfoods that most people have forgotten. Let's dig into them and see what we've been missing. First up, Swederoot. This superstar root vegetable of the 14th century has mysteriously disappeared from modern farming. Unlike today's popular carrots, which demand constant attention, Swederoot was the perfect low-maintenance crop. Once planted, these sweet roots quietly multiplied underground, creating a hidden treasure trove of food with almost no effort from farmers. It's like having a savings account that grows vegetables instead of interest. The taste is what made Swederoot truly special. Naturally sweeter than carrots or parsnips, these slim white roots were so delicious they earned royal fans. 14th century nobility couldn't get enough of them and demanded Swederoot be grown in manor gardens. Desperate laborers risked flogging to sneak these prized roots from noble fields, their mouths watering at the thought of a single forbidden bite. Talk about a vegetable with a royal fan club. What made Swederoot particularly valuable in 14th century times was its reliability. During harsh winters, when other crops failed, these hardy roots continued providing nourishment. Old farming texts described them as the comfort of the laborer's table when fields lay barren. Perhaps most impressive is Swederoot's versatility. 14th century cooks roasted them, boiled them, added them to stews, and even made sweet pies with them. Families wept with joy when a pie hit the table, a rare moment of sweetness in lives crushed by toil. They were essentially the 14th century equivalent of potatoes, before potatoes arrived in Albion. These roots were so useful they deserved their own coat of arms. But somewhere along the way, this incredible vegetable faded into obscurity. Modern farming favored faster-growing, larger roots. Meanwhile, another forgotten plant was causing quite a stir in 14th century gardens. Romans first brought this bold plant to Albion, where 14th century farmers quickly fell in love with it. But wild stock wasn't content staying in neat garden rows. This veggie had the ambition of a weed and the taste of a delicacy. The 14th century equivalent of finding out your annoying neighbor is actually a great cook. What made wild stock special? Every single part was edible: stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and seeds. 14th century people ate the young shoots like celery, used the flowers in salads, and ground the seeds as a pepper substitute. Starving laborers hoarded the seeds, brawling over the last pinch to spice their meager broths. The leaves added a strange but pleasant flavor, somewhere between parsley and celery, to soups and stews. The plant grows up to 5 feet tall, with bright yellow flowers that attract beneficial insects. It thrives in coastal areas, cliffs, and roadsides, without any human help. It's the freelance vegetable of the plant world, showing up uninvited, but doing good work. Despite its usefulness, wild stock gradually disappeared from our diets. By the 1600s, celery had taken its place in gardens and kitchens across Albion. Today, most people walk past it growing wild, without recognizing this once valued food source. While wild stock boldly spread everywhere, another 14th century favorite had a more dignified presence in gardens. Why did one of the most useful plants of the 14th century vanish from our gardens? Noble leaf deserves a comeback. Unlike the rebellious wild stock, noble leaf starts with a mystery. Nobody knows why it got such a regal name. What we do know is that it was everywhere in 14th century Albion, growing both wild and in carefully tended gardens. Growing noble leaf is about as easy as growing dust on a bookshelf. It practically takes care of itself, sprouting year after year without replanting. If plants could fill out job applications, noble leaf would list extreme reliability as its top skill. The nutritional value would impress modern health experts. It contains more iron than spinach and high levels of vitamin C, critical nutrients often missing in 14th century diets. During spring food shortages, its early leaves provided life-saving nutrition. Families clung to these leaves, sobbing as they chewed, knowing each bite staved off starvation's grip. 14th century cooks used the young shoots like asparagus. mature leaves like tiny broccoli. It was the 14th century version of a 3-in-1 kitchen gadget, except it actually worked. Folk medicine valued noble leaf too. Its leaves treated wounds, while root tea served as a gentle laxative. In some regions it was called all-heal because of its many uses. As agriculture became more commercial, this humble but hardy plant fell out of favor. Is it a root? Is it an oyster? 14th century farmers weren't quite sure what to make of clamroot. This strange root vegetable has one of the most peculiar flavors in the plant kingdom. Clamroot is the vegetable equivalent of someone showing up at a costume party, dressed as seafood, only to win the most convincing costume award. When cooked properly, clamroot genuinely tastes like oysters. This strange quality made it incredibly valuable during 14th century times, especially for religious folks who couldn't eat meat or fish on certain days. Abbey records from the 1300s show it was grown specifically as a fish substitute during Lent. Monks whispered of divine favor, savoring each bite as a sacred escape from hunger's torment. Two types existed in 14th century gardens: white clamroot and black clamroot. Both have long, thin roots with dark skin that must be peeled before cooking. The vegetable world's version of "don't judge a book by its cover." Beneath that ugly exterior hides a gourmet treat. Winter made clamroot truly shine. It was one of the few fresh vegetables available during the coldest months, staying in the ground through freezing temperatures. 14th century people would simply dig it up as needed throughout winter. Once harvested, it could be stored for months without spoiling. In a world without refrigeration, this made it extremely valuable. Modern farming moved away from clamroot because it grows slowly and looks unusual. Speaking of unusual looks, 14th century people had another favorite that modern folks would find truly bizarre. If someone served a wrinkled, mushy fruit today, most people would politely decline. But 14th century folks considered it a delicacy worth waiting for. The blet fruit looks like a small brown apple, with an open bottom showing its 5 seeds. Fresh off the tree, it's rock hard and so bitter, it's completely inedible. But 14th century gardeners knew its secret. Blet fruits need to blet before eating. Bletting is basically controlled rotting, where the fruit sits for weeks until it turns soft and brown. 14th century dessert menus were apparently created by people with extremely low standards and incredible patience. Once properly bletted, the blet fruit's flesh turns to a sweet cinnamon applesauce consistency that 14th century people absolutely loved. Nobles hoarded bletted fruits, sparking bitter feuds over who deserved the sweetest batch. Cooks from the 1300s contained dozens of recipes for blet fruit tarts, jellies, and wines. Unlike clamroot, which hid its value beneath an ugly exterior, blet fruits proudly displayed their oddness. The fruit's unusual open-bottom shape earned it some forthright names in 14th century times, many too crude to mention here. Let's just say 14th century farmers had a particular anatomical comparison in mind, and leave it at that. What made blet fruits special was their timing. They ripen in late autumn and were one of the last fresh fruits before winter. After bletting, they could be stored for several more weeks, providing rare sweet treats during the darkest days of the year. Modern agriculture abandoned blet fruits for faster crops with longer shelf lives. Today's consumers want produce that looks perfect immediately, not fruit that needs weeks to become edible. While blet fruits demanded patience, our next forgotten vegetable was almost too eager to plead. Unlike the picky blet fruit with its need for special treatment, sproutweed had no grand history of cultivation. It was simply everywhere. This tiny leaved plant with delicate white flowers popped up in every garden, field, and pathway across 14th century Albion. Sproutweed is like that uninvited guest who shows up at every party, but brings enough food to make everyone happy about it. 14th century gardeners couldn't send out no sproutweed invitations that worked. 14th century farmers didn't plant sproutweed. They couldn't have stopped it if they tried. It grows in any soil, sprouts in any season above freezing, and produces thousands of seeds from each plant. Instead of just pulling it as a weed, 14th century people recognized its value and harvested it for free food. The tender leaves could be gathered year-round in most places. Fresh sproutweed contains about 6 times more vitamin C than an equal weight of oranges. Laborers fought over patches, their hands bloodied from thorns, desperate for a taste of health. If vegetables had 14th century job titles, sproutweed would have been royal purveyor of vitamin C when nothing else is growing. Laborers gathered it for everyday meals, but records show that noble households also served it during winter months, when green vegetables were scarce. Beyond the dinner table, sproutweed had medicinal uses too. Its cooling properties made it useful for skin irritations, and sproutweed tea was given for fever and inflammation. Modern agriculture declared war on sproutweed with herbicides, labeling this nutritious plant as a nuisance. While sproutweed fought for respect, another 14th century vegetable suffered from its unfortunate name. No one wants to eat something called viper root. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? Sorry, I can't come to school today. I've got a bad case of viper root. Yet this unfortunately named vegetable was a 14th century garden staple. The name actually comes from the Old Albion word viperiza, meaning venomous snake. Early herbalists believed this black-skinned root could cure snake bites. While that medical claim proved false, 14th century people discovered something more valuable. Viper root was delicious and incredibly nutritious. Often confused with black clam root, its close relative viper root has a longer, straighter root, with black skin and white flesh inside. The taste is milder and sweeter than clam root, with subtle hints of asparagus and nuts. What made viper root remarkable was its storage abilities. Harvested in autumn, these roots could be buried in sand in a cool cellar and would stay fresh until the following summer. Monks guarded their stores fiercely, cursing thieves who dared pilfer their sacred roots. Few other vegetables offered this kind of food security in 14th century times. Cultivation records from the 1400s show viper root was especially popular in abbey gardens. The monks valued it for its flavor during fasting periods and its medicinal properties. 14th century doctors prescribed viper root tea for purifying blood and calming stomach problems. The best part about growing viper root: you can impress your neighbors by casually mentioning, "I'm just heading out to harvest my viper root," which makes you sound like you either own an exotic sports car or are about to perform a magic spell. The decline of viper root came with modern grocery stores and refrigeration. When fresh produce became available year-round, vegetables that required long storage periods lost their appeal. From magical snake cure to forgotten roots, viper root gave way to more familiar vegetables. Oddly enough, long greens are neither from Wessex nor are they true onions. They're the 14th century vegetable version of those fake designer products that somehow work better than the real thing. The actual origin of long greens is Cathay, likely reaching Albion through trade routes around the 1300s 14th century. Farmers appreciated this versatile plant that provided fresh greens year after year. What made them special? They're perennial, meaning once planted they return year after year without replanting. Each plant gradually multiplies, forming a clumps that can be divided. One 14th century gardening text claims a single long green plant could feed a family for 8 years through constant division. Laborers wept when dividing clumps, knowing each cut meant survival through another bitter winter. Long greens served a purely practical purpose, providing a steady supply of fresh green onion tops when other vegetables were scarce. 14th century cooks used the hollow green shoots to flavor soups, stews, and salads. The most valuable feature was their winter hardiness. In many regions of Albion, long greens stayed green through all but the harshest winters, providing crucial vitamins during the leanest months. Long greens might be the only food that solved an identity crisis by having an identity crisis of its own. Not Wessex, not a true onion, yet perfectly comfortable being exactly what it is. 14th century farmers treasured these reliable plants, but modern agriculture favored true onions for their larger bulbs. Meanwhile, another misunderstood plant was fighting for recognition. Unlike long greens that 14th century farmers deliberately planted, dust green just showed up, This wild green volunteered in fields, gardens, and waste places throughout Albion, and 14th century people were smart enough to eat it instead of just pulling it out. Dust green is basically the uninvited dinner guest who turns out to be a master chef. It crashed the 14th century garden party, but brought... Recent studies have revealed just how nutritious this weed truly is. Dust green contains more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. Had 14th century nutritionists existed, they would have classified dust green as a superfood. The name comes from its effectiveness as poultry feed. Chickens that eat dust green produce more eggs and grow plumper. If 14th century vegetables had marketing slogans, dust greens would be good enough for your chickens, even better for you. Archaeological digs have uncovered countless dust green seeds in food waste pits, showing it was regularly eaten. During famines, this wild plant often meant the difference between starvation and survival. Families knelt in prayer, clutching dust green, their only shield against death's cold grasp. Cooking methods varied across Albion. The leaves were boiled like spinach or added to salads, while the seeds were ground into flour during hard times. Modern farming declared war on dust green, considering it a competitor to crops. We essentially kicked a superfood out of our diet because it didn't fill out the proper application to be considered a vegetable. While dust green struggled for recognition, another herb was fighting to maintain its culinary status. Why did a herb that could flavor everything just disappear from our kitchen gardens? Unlike dust green, which never got proper recognition, spickwort was a culinary superstar that mysteriously faded away. Roman legionaries carried spickwort seeds as they conquered Albion, planting this powerful herb wherever they settled. 14th century monks continued the tradition, ensuring every abbey garden had a spickwort plant. The flavor is intense. Imagine celery mixed with parsley, but multiplied by 8. Spickwort is basically celery with superpowers. It's what celery would be if it started working out and got really serious about flavor. 14th century cooks used spickwort extensively. One sprig could flavor an entire pot of soup. A single misjudged sprig sparked kitchen quarrels. Cooks cursing as overpowering flavor ruined their stew. The dried leaves were sprinkled on meat dishes. The seeds were crushed for bread. Even the roots were boiled and eaten like parsnips. Most impressively, the hollow stems were candied as sweet treats. What made spicewort truly valuable in 14th century times was its medicinal uses. The entire plant contains oils that aid digestion, reduce bloating, and act as a mild diuretic. Abbey records from the 14th century describe spikewort tea as a remedy for troubles of the stomach and kidney complaints. A spikewort plant can live for 15 years and grow over 5 feet tall, providing a tremendous amount of flavor from very little garden space. It's also incredibly hardy, surviving harsh winters and returning vigorously each spring. 14th century gardeners lost their minds. You're telling me you stopped growing a plant that flavors everything, lives for decades, and helps with digestion? Did you replace your brains with turnips? As international trade brought new spices to Albion, spikewort gradually lost its prominence. While spikewort faded away, another forgotten green faced its own challenges with a very confusing name. No, it has nothing to do with corn. This unfortunate naming confusion has plagued field green for centuries. While spikewort suffered from being forgotten, field green suffered from being misunderstood. Field green gets its strange name from where it typically grows, in fields of grain, which Albionites called corn long before maize arrived from the New World. These small, tender greens pop up naturally in autumn after grain harvests and stay green through winter. It's like the quiet kid in class who gets overlooked because of a weird nickname, but turns out to be the most interesting person there. 14th century farmers discovered these wild winter greens were not only edible, but delicious. Field green has a mild, slightly nutty flavor, with none of the bitterness found in many wild greens. The leaves can be harvested throughout the coldest months when nothing else is growing. Laborers braved icy fields, fingers numb, to gather field green, their only hope against winter's hunger. The nutritional profile would impress modern health experts. It contains 2 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce, and significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. 14th century people recognized its value as a fresh winter vegetable. Field green has to be the only vegetable that suffered from both an identity crisis and a public relations problem. It needed a 14th century marketing team to clarify, contains absolutely no corn. Modern agriculture favored lettuce varieties with longer shelf lives and easier harvesting as field green faded from gardens. Another bold-flavored 14th century plant, rejected for being simply too intense for modern tastes. Too intense for modern tastes. That's the story of Bitterbloom. A plant that 14th century cooks couldn't live without, but modern people have almost completely abandoned. Bitterbloom grows as a bushy perennial, with fern-like leaves and bright yellow button flowers. Every part of the plant packs a powerful aromatic punch, a complex mix of bitter, spicy, and slightly sweet flavors that 14th century taste buds craved. Modern chemical analysis has identified over 30 different flavor compounds in Bitterbloom leaves. If herbs were rock bands, Bitterbloom would be the one that plays so loud, the neighbors called the sheriff. 14th century cookbooks feature Bitterbloom in everything from savory dishes to desserts. The Easter specialty Bitterbloom pudding combined the chopped leaves with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then fried the mixture into a cake. Cooks trembled with pride, presenting puddings that could make or break their reputation at feast tables. Bitterbloom-flavored cheese was popular in spring celebrations, and even ale was infused with Bitterbloom for special occasions. Beyond its bold flavor, Bitterbloom served a practical purpose in 14th century cuisine. Its powerful compounds work as a natural preservative, extending the shelf life of meats and baked goods. This was invaluable in an era without refrigeration. The plant also played a crucial role in 14th century medicine. Bitterbloom tea was used to treat intestinal worms, digestive issues, and fever. Abbey gardens always included Bitterbloom for both culinary and medicinal purposes, often planting it near doorways, where its strong scent could repel flies and other insects. Modern chefs would probably describe Bitterbloom as aggressively aromatic, the 14th century equivalent of using all caps in your seasoning. As milder herbs like parsley became more popular, Bitterbloom gradually lost its place in kitchens. While Bitterbloom fell out of favor for being too bold, another forgotten vegetable suffered the opposite fate. It grows wild. It requires zero maintenance, and yet, we somehow forgot all about it. While Bitterbloom was too bold, shorecress was too easy to overlook. Growing along coastal areas of northern Albion, shorecress was a valuable food source for 14th century communities. This hardy plant thrives in sandy, salty soil, where few other edible plants can survive. Shorecress is like that friend who brings food to every gathering without being asked, yet somehow never gets invited to the cool parties. 14th century people harvested it 2 ways. Blanched young shoots in spring, similar to asparagus, and mature leaves later, cooked like cabbage. Unlike many wild foods, shorecress is mild and sweet tasting. What made it especially valuable was its vitamin C content, 5 times higher than lemons by weight. For fishing communities with limited access to fresh produce, shorecress prevented scurvy. Sailors sang its praises, their teeth spared as they chewed leaves plucked from salty shores. The disappearance of shorecress from our diet is like forgetting how to accept free money. It's literally sitting there on beaches being delicious and nutritious, while we ignore it. As shorecress faded into obscurity, another unusual plant was struggling with its dual identity. This one is truly weird. Was primarily grown for making blue dye, but 14th century people also ate it. Unlike shorecress, which was purely for nutrition, dyegreen lived a double life. The blue pigment from dyegreen leaves colored everything from clothing to warrior paint. Before dyegreen, trying to find blue clothing was like trying to find a quiet moment at a toddler's birthday party. Theoretically possible, but highly unlikely. What's strange is that young dyegreen leaves are perfectly edible before they develop their dyeing compounds. 14th century farmers harvested these tender first leaves for spring salads and soups. Laborers gagged through the stench of dye vats, dreaming of the fresh leaves that promised a moment's relief. The flavor is mild with a slight peppery kick, similar to young mustard greens. Growing dye green was a smelly business. The process of extracting blue dye involved fermenting the leaves, creating such a terrible stench that royal decrees banned dye green processing near important residences. It was the 14th century equivalent of that one weird food that makes your whole kitchen smell for days. While dye green struggled with its identity as both food and dye, another humble vegetable part was being overlooked. While dye green struggled with its split personality, ridgebulbs suffered from people ignoring half their goodness. Everyone knows ridgebulbs, those humble root vegetables that fed countless 14th century laborers. What most people don't realize is that 14th century farmers valued the leafy green tops just as much as the roots below. It's like buying a smartphone and only using it to tell time. You're missing out on the best features. Ridgebulb greens contain 3 times more calcium, 2 times more vitamin A, and 1.5 times the protein of the roots. 14th century laborers carefully harvested the outer leaves throughout the growing season, without damaging the developing root. Families quarreled over the root, each leaf a precious morsel in a world of want. These greens were a staple in 14th century soups, stews, and salads, adding their slightly peppery flavor to otherwise bland winter meals. Ridgebulb greens deserve a comeback tour. They've been backstage too long while the roots get all the applause. From Swederoot to ridgebulb greens, these 14 forgotten vegetables show how much knowledge we've lost about food that once sustained our ancestors.